She walked into town barefoot and bleeding with nothing but a baby and her husband's dying words. The sun was dying behind the mountains when she walked into Cedar Ridge, and Tom Brennan would remember that sunset for the rest of his life. Not because of the way the light painted the dusty street gold, or how the shadows stretched long and thin like fingers reaching for something they'd never touch. He'd remember it because of her. She moved like a ghost made solid, each step leaving a small red mark on the dirt road. Her feet were bare and torn, the soles split open from walking on rocks and thorns and the hard truth of desert ground. The baby in her arms cried with a sound that cut through the evening air like a prayer that had given up hope of being answered. Her dress had once been blue, the kind of blue that spoke of Sunday mornings and careful stitching by lamplight. Now it hung in tatters, stained dark with blood and sweat and the dust of too many miles. Her hair, once pinned neat and proper, fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that stopped Brennan cold as he watched from the porch of his office. They were the eyes of someone who had seen everything end. The townspeople pressed their faces to windows, safe behind glass and wooden walls. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Old Pete stepped back into the shadows of the saloon doorway. Even the dogs seemed to sense something broken about this woman and kept their distance, whimpering softly from beneath the wooden sidewalks. She made it as far as the general store before her legs gave out. Brennan watched her sink to her knees on the wooden steps, still holding the baby close to her chest. Her lips moved, but no sound came at first. Then, like a wind that carries the scent of rain after a long drought, her voice drifted across the street. "Find the good people, Sarah. Find them and hold on." She said it again and again, like she was trying to remember something precious that kept slipping away. The baby's cries grew softer, as if even the child understood that this was a moment for quiet words and careful breathing. Brennan had been sheriff of Cedar Ridge for 5 years, ever since the fever took his Mary and little James and left him with nothing but a badge and a need to keep moving. He'd seen his share of people at the end of their rope. Drifters with empty pockets and emptier stomachs. Cowboys who'd lost their way between towns. Women running from husbands who used their fists to settle arguments. But this was different. This woman wasn't running from something. She was carrying it with her, holding it as carefully as she held that crying baby. He stepped off the porch and walked across the street, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. Up close, he could see the cuts on her feet went deep. The blood on her dress wasn't just dirt and travel stains. Some of it was fresh, dark red against the faded fabric. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "You need help." She looked up at him, and Brennan felt something twist in his chest. Her eyes were green, the color of grass after spring rain, but they held a weight that made him think of graves and goodbyes and all the words that come too late. "He said I'd find good people," she whispered. "He promised me I would." "Who promised you that?" "Jacob, my husband." Her voice broke on the word. "Before he died, before I buried him with my own hands and walked away from everything we built." The baby had gone quiet now, small fists curled against its mother's chest. Brennan could see it was a girl, maybe 6 months old, with dark hair that curled at the edges just like her mother's. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. "This is Mary. She's all I have left." Brennan knelt down beside her on the wooden steps. He could smell the desert on her skin, the dust and heat and something else. Something that reminded him of the morning he'd found his own family cold and still in their bed, the fever having taken them in the night while he slept in his office, too afraid of catching it to come home. "I'm Tom Brennan. Sheriff here." He looked into those green eyes and saw himself reflected there, saw the same hollow ache he'd been carrying for 3 years. "How long have you been walking?" 6 days. Maybe 7. I lost count." She shifted the baby in her arms, and Brennan saw her wince. "I ran out of water yesterday. Mary needs milk. She needs—" Her words faded into nothing, and for a moment the only sound was the evening wind moving through the buildings, carrying the scent of horses and hay and the wood smoke from dinner fires. "Jacob was a good man," she said suddenly. "He built us a house by the creek. 10 miles east of Willow Bend. We had chickens and a garden and plans for more children. Her voice grew smaller. The raiders came at dawn. Jacob held them off long enough for me to get Mary and run. I heard the shots. I knew. Brennan understood. He'd heard those same final shots in his own memory. Those had been the sound of shallow, breathing stopping, the silence that follows the last exhale. I went back when it was over, Sarah continued. Found him by the front door, still holding his rifle. Still, she closed her eyes. I dug his grave in the garden, next to the tomatoes he planted last spring. Used his own shovel. Took me all day. The townspeople were still watching from their windows, but Brennan paid them no mind. He'd learned that grief was a private thing, even when it happened in the middle of Main Street with the whole world looking on. What did he tell you to do? He asked. Sarah's eyes opened, focusing on his face. He made me promise to take Mary and go somewhere safe. Said there were still good people in the world, and if I looked hard enough, I'd find them. She touched the baby's cheek with one finger. Cedar Ridge was the first town name he could think of. He'd heard it was peaceful here, quiet. Brennan looked around at the familiar buildings, the fading light painting everything the color of old gold. Cedar Ridge was quiet, that much was true. Quiet enough that a man could think too much about what he'd lost. Quiet enough that the sound of his own footsteps on empty floors could drive him to sleep in his office most nights. He was right, Brennan said. About the good people, I mean. They're here. They're just scared of what they don't understand. Sarah tried to smile, but it came out broken at the edges. I don't have any money. No family. Nothing to offer except these words Jacob gave me, and this baby who needs more than I know how to give her. Brennan stood up and held out his hand. Come on. Let's get you both inside before full dark. There's a room above the jail that's been empty too long. It's not much, but it's clean and safe. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and Brennan saw her weighing trust against desperation, hope against the fear of being disappointed again. Finally, she placed her fingers in his palm, and he helped her to her feet. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but not contentment either. The sound of someone too young to understand loss, but old enough to feel the absence of safety. Jacob would have liked you, Sarah said as they walked slowly toward the jail. He always said you could tell good people by how they treated strangers and stray dogs. Brennan thought about that as he unlocked the door to his office, as he lit the lantern and led her up the narrow stairs to the room where he sometimes slept when the silence in his own house became too heavy to bear. The room had a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street where she'd collapsed just minutes before. There's water in the pitcher, he said, setting the lantern on the small table. I'll bring you some food and milk for the baby. In the morning, we'll figure out what comes next. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding Mary close. What comes next? She repeated, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. I haven't thought past getting here. Past keeping his promise. Brennan paused in the doorway, looking back at the woman and child who had walked into his town, carrying nothing but grief and hope in a dead man's final words. In the lamplight, Sarah's face looked younger, less carved by loss. The baby had settled into sleep, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of perfect trust. Sometimes, he said quietly, not knowing what comes next is the only way to find out what's possible. As he closed the door behind him and walked back down the stairs, Brennan found himself thinking about the room above his head, how it would sound with voices in it again, with the soft breathing of people who were still alive, still hoping. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled into another quiet evening, but something had changed in the space between sunset and full dark. Something that made the silence feel less empty and more like the pause between one breath and the next, waiting to see what words might come. The lantern flame danced between them, casting shadows that moved like memories across the walls of Tom Brennan's office. Sarah sat in the wooden chair beside his desk, baby Mary finally quiet in her arms after drinking the warm milk he'd brought from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen. The child's small fingers curled around her mother's thumb, holding on with the perfect faith that only comes before the world teaches you that holding on sometimes isn't enough. Brennan poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on his stove since morning, the liquid dark and bitter as creek water after a storm. He handed Sarah a cup, their fingers brushing for just a moment. Her skin was cold despite the warmth of the room. "You don't have to tell me anything more tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Morning will come soon enough." Sarah looked down at Mary's sleeping face, then back at him. "I've been carrying this story for 6 days. It gets heavier every mile I don't tell it." Outside, Cedar Ridge had settled into the deep quiet that comes after midnight, when even the saloon falls silent and the only sounds are the wind through the buildings and the distant call of night birds. The kind of quiet that makes whispered words sound like prayers. "Jacob woke me before dawn," Sarah began, her voice soft as dust settling. "Said he'd heard horses coming from the east. Too many horses for honest travelers." She shifted Mary in her arms, the baby making small sounds in her sleep. "He told me to take Mary and hide in the root cellar behind the house. Said no matter what I heard, no matter how long it took, I wasn't to come out until the sun was high and the world was quiet again." Brennan set his coffee cup down without drinking. He'd heard stories like this before, but never from someone who'd lived through it. Never from someone whose eyes still held the smoke of burning dreams. "I didn't want to leave him alone. We'd built that house together board by board. Painted it yellow because he said it looked like sunshine even on gray days." Her smile came and went like summer lightning. "But Mary started to fuss, and I knew the sound would carry. So I kissed him goodbye and took our baby to hide in the dark." The lantern flame flickered, and for a moment the room grew dim. Brennan reached over and turned the wick higher, chasing the shadows back to the corners where they belonged. "I heard them ride up as the sun was coming over the hills," Sarah continued. 5 men, maybe 6. Their voices were rough like rocks grinding together. They wanted food, they said. Water. Money. Jacob told them we didn't have much, but they were welcome to what we could spare. She paused, looking into the coffee cup as if she might find different words there, words that would change what came next. That wasn't enough for them. One of them said something about the house being in a good spot, good water, good land. Said it was wasted on a small family. Sarah's voice grew smaller. Jacob told them the land wasn't for sale, that we planned to raise our children there, grow old there. Brennan felt something tighten in his chest. He knew how this story ended, but knowing didn't make the telling easier to hear. "They laughed," Sarah whispered. "Laughed like Jacob had told them a joke. Then one of them said they'd take it anyway, along with anything else worth taking. Including me." Mary stirred in her mother's arms, making soft baby sounds. Sarah rocked her gently, the motion automatic as breathing. That's when Jacob went back into the house for his rifle. I could hear his boots on the wooden floor, hear him talking to himself the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. Then I heard the front door open again. She stopped, and the silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Brennan waited, knowing that some words needed their own time to find their way into the light. Jacob called out that he was armed and ready to defend what was his. Told them to ride on and leave us in peace. One of the men laughed again and said, "Dead men don't defend anything." Sarah's hands trembled slightly around the coffee cup. The shooting started after that. Brennan had been in his share of gunfights during his years wearing a badge. He knew the sound of bullets finding their mark, knew the difference between shots fired in anger and shots fired with deadly purpose. But he'd never had to listen from a root cellar while someone he loved fought alone against impossible odds. "It lasted maybe 2 minutes," Sarah said. "Seemed like hours. I could hear Jacob calling my name, telling me to stay hidden, to keep Mary safe. Then everything went quiet." She set the coffee cup on the desk, her hands shaking too much to hold it steady. "I waited like he told me to. Waited until the sun was high and hot, and the only sound were the chickens scratching in the dirt. When I finally came out, the raiders were gone. They'd taken the horses, the few silver dollars we kept in the coffee tin, some food from the kitchen. And Jacob," Brennan asked quietly. "I found him by the front door, still holding his rifle. 3 bullets in his chest, but he was still breathing, still trying to talk." Tears ran down Sarah's cheeks, but her voice stayed steady. "He made me promise to take Mary and leave. Said the raiders might come back, and next time they wouldn't be looking for things they could carry away. Mary woke up and began to cry, a thin sound that filled the small office. Sarah stood and began to walk the floor, bouncing the baby gently, humming a tune that sounded like something a person might sing while working in a garden or hanging clothes on a line. Brennan watched them move back and forth in the lantern light, and something cracked open inside his chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the morning he'd found his own wife and son still and cold in their bed, taken by the fever while he slept alone in this same office, too afraid of losing them to risk being close. He died while I was digging the grave, Sarah continued, still walking, still humming. Died looking up at the sky, holding onto my hand. His last words were about finding good people, about how there were still some left in the world, and if I looked hard enough, I'd find them. Mary's cries softened to whimpers, then to the quiet breathing of sleep. But Sarah kept walking, kept moving like stopping might let the grief catch up and pull her under. I buried him next to the tomato plants, she whispered. Said words over him that I remembered from church services when I was young. Then I packed what I could carry, took Mary, and started walking east towards Cedar Ridge. Brennan stood up and joined her in walking the floor, staying a few steps behind, not wanting to crowd her grief, but needing to move, needing to do something with the weight that had settled in his chest. 6 days through desert country, Sarah said. Mary crying when she was hungry, me singing to her when she was scared. We slept under stars and drank from creek beds and ate the few biscuits I'd managed to pack before we left. They walked in silence for a while, two people carrying different losses, but the same understanding of what it meant to be left alone in a world that kept spinning no matter how much it hurt to watch. I kept thinking about Jacob's words, Sarah said finally, about good people, about how they were still out there somewhere. When my feet started bleeding, I told myself I just had to walk a little farther. When Mary cried from hunger, I told myself we just had to make it to the next town. She stopped walking and looked at Brennan directly for the first time since she'd started telling her story. When I saw you step off that porch tonight, when you knelt down beside me on those steps, I knew Jacob was right. I knew I'd found what he promised was still out there. Brennan felt his throat close up. He wanted to tell her about Mary, his Mary, and little James. Wanted to tell her how he'd failed them, how he'd been too scared of the fever to hold them while they died, how he'd been sleeping alone in this office every night since because their house still smelled like sickness and loss. Instead, he said, "Your husband sounds like he was a good man. He was. He made me promise to live, even after he was gone. Made me promise to give Mary a chance to grow up somewhere safe." She looked down at the sleeping baby. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be enough for her when I can barely stand up some days. Mary made a small sound in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out as if looking for something to hold on to. Sarah caught the small fingers with her own, and the baby settled back into quiet dreams. Sometimes, Brennan said quietly, being enough just means being willing to keep trying. Sarah looked at him again, and in her green eyes he saw the same question he'd been asking himself for 3 years. How do you keep going when everything you loved is buried in the ground? I should let you get some rest, he said, though neither of them moved toward the stairs that led to the room above. I'm not sure I remember how to sleep in a real bed, Sarah admitted. These past 6 nights, I've been listening for everything. Coyotes, wind, riders coming in the dark. Mary and I, we've gotten used to sleeping light. Brennan understood. He'd been sleeping light himself for longer than he cared to count. I'll be right here, he said. This office, this chair. I'll listen for both of you. Sarah nodded, and something passed between them in the lantern light. Not words, not promises, just the recognition of two people who had learned that safety was something you created one quiet night at a time. As she climbed the stairs with Mary in her arms, Brennan settled back into his chair and turned the lantern down low. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under a sky full of stars that looked the same whether you were grieving or celebrating, alone or surrounded by the people you loved. But inside the small office, something had changed. The silence felt different somehow, less empty and more like the pause between question and answer, between ending and beginning, between the story you've been telling and the one you might yet live to tell. The first week passed like water, finding its way around stones. slow, and careful, and following the path of least resistance. Sarah woke each morning to sunlight streaming through the small window above the sheriff's office, Mary gurgling contentedly in the wooden crate that served as her bed. The sounds of Cedar Ridge drifted up from the street below, horses moving at an easy pace, the creak of wagon wheels, voices calling morning greetings across the dusty thoroughfare. It was a different kind of waking than she'd known on the homestead. There, mornings had meant chickens to feed and eggs to gather, Jacob's voice drifting from the barn where he talked to the horses while he worked. Now, mornings meant the soft sound of Tom Brennan's boots on the stairs, the gentle knock that told her coffee was ready and another day had begun. He brought her breakfast on the second day, and she'd tried to refuse it. "I can't pay you for this kindness," she'd said, holding Mary close while the baby fussed with hunger. "I have nothing to offer in return." Brennan had set the tray on the small table by the window, coffee, biscuits, milk still warm for Mrs. Patterson's cow. "You're offering plenty," he'd said quietly. "More than you know." Sarah hadn't understood then, but as the days settled into rhythm, she began to see what he meant. The room above his office had been empty for 3 years, gathering dust and silence like cobwebs in the corners. Now it held the sound of a baby's cries and a woman's lullabies, the rustle of fabric being mended, the soft conversations that came with shared meals. By the third day, Sarah had begun to feel restless in her gratitude. She'd found needle and thread in the room's small dresser, left there by some previous occupant, and asked Mrs. Patterson if there was mending work to be done in town. Word spread quickly, and soon there was a steady stream of shirts with torn seams, dresses with loose buttons, children's clothes that needed letting out or taking in. Sarah worked by the window where the light was best, Mary sleeping in her lap or playing quietly on a blanket spread across the floor. Her needle moved with practiced precision, each stitch neat and small and strong enough to last. The work reminded her of evenings on the homestead, sitting by lamplight while Jacob read aloud from the newspaper that came once a week from the territorial capital. Jacob used to say that mending was like forgiveness, she told Brennan one evening as he sat across from her, watching her repair a tear in young Billy Henderson's school shirt, taking something broken and making it useful again, making it whole. Brennan sipped his coffee, studying her face in the lamplight. "Sounds like a wise man." He was. Sometimes I think he knew things he never told me. Like maybe he could see trouble coming long before it arrived. She held up the shirt, examining her work. "He started teaching me to shoot that last winter. Said every woman should know how to protect what she loved. I thought he was just being careful." Mary babbled from her place on the floor, reaching for the wooden spools of thread that caught the evening light like small jewels. At 7 months old, she was beginning to sit up on her own, her dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world around her. "She looks like you," Brennan observed, watching the baby try to capture a dust mote dancing in the lamplight. Sarah smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had that first night. "Jacob used to say she had my stubborn streak. Said she'd get that chin set just like mine when she didn't want to do something." The smile faded slightly. "I wish you could see her now. See how she's growing." They sat in comfortable silence while Sarah finished the mending. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled into evening quiet, the saloon piano playing a slow tune that drifted on the warm air through the open window. It was a peaceful sound, the kind that made a person feel safe and settled. "The town's talking," Brennan said finally, his voice careful and neutral. Sarah's needle paused in its work. "About what?" "About you staying here. About me letting you stay." He set his coffee cup down and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Henderson thinks it's improper. Says a widow should be staying with a family, not above a bachelor's office." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd heard the whispers when she walked to the general store, seen the way some of the women looked at her with expressions that mixed pity and disapproval in equal measure. "Maybe she's right," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe I should find somewhere else to know." Brennan's voice was firm, but not harsh. "You'll stay as long as you need to. As long as you want to. What Mrs. Henderson thinks doesn't matter." Mary chose that moment to topple over backward, landing on her well-padded bottom with a look of surprise that made both adults smile despite the serious conversation. People talk because they don't understand, Brennan continued, getting up to help Mary sit upright again. They see a man and a woman under the same roof and think they know what it means. But they don't know about grief. Don't know how it changes everything. Sarah watched him settle Mary back on her blanket, his movements gentle and sure. You've lost people too. It wasn't a question. She'd seen it in his eyes that first night, recognized the particular kind of careful distance that came from loving someone and losing them. My wife, Mary. My son, James. 3 years ago this winter. Brennan's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the weight underneath it. Cholera took them while I was sleeping here in the office, afraid I'd bring the sickness home if I stayed in the house. Sarah set down her needle and thread. Tom, they died alone because I was too scared to hold them. Too scared to risk getting sick myself. He looked out the window at the darkening street. I've been sleeping in that chair downstairs ever since. Can't seem to make myself go back to that house. The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Mary played quietly on her blanket, unaware of the adult pain being shared above her head. Jacob made me promise to live, Sarah said finally. Even after he was gone, even when it felt impossible. He said Mary deserved a mother who remembered how to hope. Some promises are harder to keep than others. Yes. Sarah picked up her needle again, but didn't resume sewing. Some days I feel like I'm just pretending to be alive. Going through the motions until someone figures out I'm just an empty dress walking around. Brennan looked at her, then, really looked, and Sarah felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with words. It was recognition, pure and simple. The acknowledgement of two people who had walked through the same dark country and somehow found themselves on the other side. You're not empty, he said quietly. Empty people don't mend torn shirts or sing lullabies or worry about being a burden. Empty people don't keep promises to dying husbands. Mary started to fuss, the way she always did when bedtime approached. Sarah gathered her up, breathing in the sweet scent of baby skin and the lavender soap misses Patterson had brought for bathing. Sometimes I think about what Jacob would say if he could see us now, Sarah said, bouncing Mary gently. Living above a jail, taking charity from strangers, me working with needle and thread to earn our keep. What do you think he'd say? Sarah considered this, looking around the small room that had become home in ways she hadn't expected. I think he'd say I found them. The good people he promised were out there. I think he'd be glad we weren't alone. Brennan stood up, preparing to leave them to their evening routine. But he paused at the top of the stairs, his hand on the wooden banister. Sarah, yes. I'm glad you're not alone either. Both of you. This place has been too quiet for too long. After he left, Sarah prepared Mary for bed, changing her into the soft nightgown that Mrs. Patterson had brought along with other necessities. As she rocked the baby to sleep, she found herself thinking about Jacob's words, the ones that had carried her across 60 miles of desert and doubt. Find the good people, Sarah. Find them and hold on. She found them. But as Mary's breathing deepened into sleep and the sounds of evening settled around them, Sarah realized that finding them was only the beginning. The harder question, the one that had been growing in her heart for days now, was what came next. How long could she stay in this borrowed safety? How long before she had to decide whether to keep drifting or to plant roots again in soil that might prove just as fragile as the ground she'd left behind? Mary sighed in her sleep, one tiny fist curled against her cheek, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of tomorrow pressing against her chest, not heavy enough to crush, but present enough to remind her that every sunset brought another sunrise, and with it, choices that couldn't be postponed forever. The first snow came in November, falling soft and silent through the gray morning air like prayers whispered by angels. Sarah woke to find the world outside her window transformed, the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge covered in white that made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Mary had learned to pull herself up to standing by then, using the wooden chair legs and Sarah's skirts to hoist her small body upright. She babbled constantly now, her voice a cheerful sound that filled the corners of the room that had been too quiet for too long. At 9 months old, she was all curiosity and motion, reaching for everything within her grasp and protesting loudly when the interesting world was moved beyond her fingers. "Look at that snow, sweet girl," Sarah said, holding Mary up to the window where she could see the white flakes dancing in the wind. "Your papa will love this. He always said snow made the world look like hope." Mary pressed her small palms against the cold glass, leaving tiny handprints that caught the morning light. Her breath fogged the window in small circles that appeared and disappeared like secrets being whispered and forgotten. Brennan's footsteps on the stairs had become as regular as sunrise, and Sarah found herself listening for them each morning, the familiar rhythm that marked the beginning of another day. He knocked gently, as always, and entered with coffee and the warm biscuits that Mrs. Patterson sent over each morning with enough regularity that Sarah suspected Brennan was paying her for the kindness. "Cold morning," he said, setting the tray on the small table. "Looks like winter's decided to settle in early this year." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Mary's never seen snow before. She was born in spring, and we had a mild winter last year at the homestead. Mary had discovered that her babbling created small clouds of warm breath in the cold air by the window, and she was testing this phenomenon with great scientific interest, saying "ba-ba-ba" with increasing volume and watching the results. "She's going to be walking soon," Brennan observed, watching Mary cruise along the wall, using her hands to steady herself as she moved from one piece of furniture to the next. "I keep thinking Jacob should be here to see it," Sarah said quietly. Her first steps, her first words. All the things parents wait for and remember forever. Brennan sat down in his usual chair, cradling his coffee in hands that bore the calluses and scars of a man who'd worked with them his whole life. "He is seeing it, in a way. Through you. Through the stories you'll tell her about him when she's old enough to understand." Sarah had been thinking about that more often lately. What story she would tell Mary about the father she'd never remember. How do you explain love to someone who never got to feel it directly? How do you describe a man's laughter, his morning voice, the way his hands felt when they brushed flour from your cheek after a day of baking? The weeks had passed like pages turning in a familiar book, each day bringing small moments of ordinary grace. Sarah's mending work had grown steady, and she'd managed to save enough coins to contribute to the cost of their food and supplies. It wasn't much, but it was something, a way of holding onto her dignity while accepting help she desperately needed. The people of Cedar Ridge had slowly grown accustomed to seeing her around town, Mary bundled in her arms, or, more recently, tottering along beside her on increasingly steady legs. The whispers had faded, replaced by nods of greeting and small kindnesses that spoke of acceptance, if not understanding. Mrs. Henderson had even brought over a jar of preserved peaches one afternoon, setting it on the counter with the gruff comment that babies need fruit in winter. She'd left before Sarah could properly thank her, but the gesture had warmed Sarah's heart more than the woman would ever know. As December settled over Cedar Ridge like a familiar quilt, Sarah found herself thinking about Christmas. It would be Mary's first, though the baby was too young to understand the significance. It would also be Sarah's first Christmas without Jacob, her first without the traditions they'd been building together in their small house by the creek. "What do people do for Christmas here?" she asked Brennan one evening as they sat in the usual places, Mary asleep on her blanket after an exhausting day of practicing her walking skills. "Church service Christmas morning. Families gather for big dinners. Children get small gifts if their parents can manage it." Brennan studied her face in the lamplight. "What did you and Jacob do?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "We cut a small pine tree and bring it inside, decorate it with strings of dried apples and cranberries. Jacob would read the Christmas story from his mother's Bible while I made apple cake. Nothing fancy, but it felt like everything we needed." "Sounds perfect," Brennan said, and Sarah could hear the longing in his voice. "What about you?" Before she didn't finish the sentence. They'd both learned to navigate around the sharp edges of each other's losses. Mary loved Christmas. Started planning it in October, making lists of who needed what gifts, what food to prepare. The house would smell like cinnamon and nutmeg for days. His voice grew soft. James was just old enough to get excited about it. 3 years old, and convinced that if he was good enough, Santa Claus would bring him a real horse. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. They'd learned to sit with each other's memories, to make space for the people who weren't there, but somehow still were. December 24th dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow falling in fat flakes that stuck to the window glass like lace doilies. Mary woke up babbling, as if she could sense something special about the day. She'd taken her first real steps 3 days earlier, letting go of Sarah's hands to toddle unsteadily into Brennan's outstretched arms, and she was eager to practice her new skill at every opportunity. "Merry Christmas Eve, sweet girl," Sarah said, lifting Mary from her makeshift crib. "Today feels different, doesn't it?" Evening came early, as it does in winter, and after Mary was fed and bathed and settled in her nightgown, Sarah sat by the window watching the snow continue to fall. The town looked peaceful under its white blanket, smoke rising from chimneys in straight lines against the still air. Brennan joined her by the window, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching Cedar Ridge settle into the quiet of Christmas Eve. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice careful and low, "there's something I need to tell you. About Mary and James. About the night they died." Sarah turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her chest tighten. "You don't have to, I do." He moved away from the window, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she'd learned meant he was wrestling with something difficult. "I need you to know who you've been trusting, who you've been letting around your daughter." Mary babbled softly from her blanket, playing with the wooden blocks that Brennan had carved for her from scraps of pine. "They've been sick for 3 days," Brennan began, his voice steady but strained. "Fever, chills, vomiting. Dr. Morrison said it was cholera, that it was spreading through the county like wildfire. Said I should stay away, that there was nothing I could do except wait and hope." Sarah sat down in her chair, but kept her eyes on his face. "You were trying to protect yourself." "No." The word came out sharp, cutting. "I was protecting myself from watching them die, from having to hold them while the life left their bodies. I told myself it was about not getting sick, but that was a lie. I was just too scared to be there when it mattered most." He sat down heavily, as if the weight of the words had been holding him upright, and now that they were spoken, he could collapse under their absence. "I slept here, in this office, while my wife called my name, while my son cried for his papa." Brennan's hands shook slightly as he spoke. "Mrs. Patterson came to get me in the morning. Said they'd passed in the night, holding hands. Said Mary had been asking for me until the very end." The room fell silent except for Mary's quiet babbling and the soft sound of snow against the window glass. Sarah felt her heart break for this man who had carried such a burden, who had punished himself for 3 years for the very human sin of being afraid. "Tom," she said softly, "look at me." He raised his eyes to hers, and in them she saw the same raw pain she'd carried after burying Jacob, the same desperate need for forgiveness that she'd whispered into the desert wind during those long days of walking. "Jacob was dying when I found him," she said quietly. "Shot 3 times, bleeding into the dirt of our garden. He lived long enough to give me his dying words, to make me promise to take Mary and find safety. But you know what he said before that?" Brennan shook his head. "He said he was sorry. Sorry for not being strong enough to protect us. Sorry for leaving us alone. Sorry for dying when we needed him most." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. Being afraid doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human." Mary chose that moment to let go of her blocks and take 3 wobbly steps toward Brennan's chair, her face bright with pride at her own accomplishment. Without thinking, he reached out and caught her as she tumbled forward, lifting her onto his lap where she immediately began exploring the buttons on his shirt. "She trusts you," Sarah said, watching them together. "Children know things adults forget. They know when someone has a good heart, even when that heart is broken." Brennan looked down at Mary, who was now trying to put his shirt button in her mouth, her dark eyes curious and completely unafraid. "I don't know how to forgive myself," he said quietly. Sarah stood up and moved to kneel beside his chair, placing her hands over his where they held Mary steady. Jacob's dying words weren't just about finding good people, she said. They were about holding on to them once you found them. About not letting fear or guilt or the weight of what you've lost keep you from accepting what's right in front of you. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in silence and possibility. Inside the small room above the sheriff's office, three people who had found each other in the ruins of their separate losses sat together in the warm glow of lamplight. Mary fell asleep against Brennan's chest, her small hand curled around his finger. Sarah remained kneeling beside them, her hands still covering his, and for the first time since walking in a cedar ridge with bleeding feet and a dying man's promise, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. She felt like she was home. "Tomorrow is Christmas," she said softly. "Will you come to church with us? Will you walk with Mary and me into that building full of good people and let them see that we belong together?" Brennan looked at her, this woman who had stumbled into his life, carrying nothing but grief and hope, and a baby who had learned to take her first steps in his presence. He thought about his empty house across town, about the bed he hadn't slept in for 3 years, about the way Mary's laughter had filled the silence that had been eating him alive. "Yes," he said quietly, "I like that very much." As Christmas Eve settled into the deep quiet of midnight, Sarah finally understood what Jacob had meant when he told her to find the good people and hold on. Sometimes holding on meant more than just surviving. Sometimes it meant having the courage to build something new from the pieces of what you'd lost, to trust that broken hearts could still learn to beat in rhythm with each other. In the morning, they would walk to church together, three hearts that had found each other in the dust and silence of their separate sorrows, ready to discover what promises the living could make to each other under the wide, forgiving sky of Christmas Day.